Welcome to the Rise of Feature panel. My name is John Goodwin. I'm the president of Galaxy Kress, and I've been involved with Rise of Feature since year 2, back in 1986-87, when the second volume came out, and we just published this past year, volume 40. What this panel is we're going to discuss the contest, tips on story prompts and short fiction. Then I also have, at the very first awards event, Ray Bradbury was a special guest, and he recorded what turns out to be a 3-minute interview on tips for new writers. And so I've got this. We found it recently, and so we made it, and we're going to show it to you. This is kind of like a premiere of the thing that you'll be able to see. And then, so the first half we'll be talking to our judges, which I'll introduce in just a moment, and then the second half we'll open to Q&As. If you have any questions for any of the judges who are present today, then you can ask them.
If you don't have any questions for us, we'll start asking you questions and write stories about you.
There we go. So Rise of the Future is a contest.
Maybe in chapter 7.
It was created in 1983 by Orson, and the purpose was to provide a helping hand for aspiring writers. And it's gone on to become the most successful contest for new writers in the world. We have entries now from over 175 countries, winners from 50 countries, and it consists of 4 quarterly contests. We have 3 winners each quarter, and it's free to enter, open to non-professional writers, and that definition can be found either online at writersofthefeature.com or in the copy back of the book. Every anthology has that. The judging is blind, so the judges only see your story or your art and a number. So you have no idea of your nationality, your ethnic, your race, your anything. They just know your number. Quite often when someone says, oh yeah, I was published in volume 39, I said, sorry, all I saw was a story and a number, so I don't really have names associated with the stories. So it's funny, introducing so they find out who the actual person is that they voted for. But anyway, so that's the contest. Like I said, it is free to enter. And how many of you are familiar with Writers of the Future? Good. How many of you actually have entered the contest? Good. So hopefully by the end of today's panel, you'll be more inspired. You will have this card up front you can get, which has a QR code to be able to get to the web page. And there's also a free Writers of the Future online workshop, which is available to anybody to take. Like I said, it's free. It's got several videos from Orson Scott Card, Tim Powers, and Dave Wolverton, as well as a dozen essays from Ellen Hubbard. And he covers all the steps to writing a short story. When you finish the online course, you actually have a short story if you do all the exercises for it. But we'll get on with this. So now, I'm going to verbally introduce and I'll have them say hello. So right next to me is Orson Scott Card.
Hello.
And next to him is Nancy Kress.
Hi.
And then next to Nancy is Hugh Howey. And next to Hugh is Robert J. Sawyer. And then we have Stephen Sterling, S.N. Sterling.
Hello.
And then Jody Lynn Nye.
Hi.
They're all contest judges. They've been with us for varying degrees. Hugh being our newest member, he's now in his 2nd year. And then Scott Card goes back to 1928 or something like that.
When I talked to him about the contest, he was enthusiastic.
So I know there's different aspects of science fiction and fantasy. So first, a little bit from your own perspective on what's happened with science fiction and fantasy over the last, since I guess the golden age, and what you've experienced with it and how it's going in the future. Scott.
Okay, probably the single biggest thing is the fading of the magazines. When I started, the magazines were still where you begin as a science fiction writer. There was no Writers of the Future contest. But as the magazines have lost circulation so that you can be published and have nobody know, Writers of the Future has taken up the slack. Because short fiction is where the field is reinvented all the time. It's so much easier to get a cool new idea and try it out in 15,000 words than in 120,000 words. And so you still find, as when I was starting out, that the new voices, the new ideas, the new manners of writing are showing up in the short fiction. And that means they're showing up in Writers of the Future.
This is how the whole field has changed since?
Yeah.
Okay, I published my first story in 1976. And at that point, science fiction was in the ascendancy and fantasy was sort of little brother. And now that has completely flipped. And fantasy is the more popular and the one that gets the most attention, and science fiction is now a little brother. And since I write not only science fiction, but hard SF, often centered on genetic engineering, I would be lying if I didn't say that I feel slightly demoted. But there were other changes. In the 70s, and this was just before I came in, there was a large influx of women into writing science fiction and fantasy, into what had been, not completely, but largely a man-preserved. There was also, in the late 60s, and this was still going on when I was there, the new wave was coming in. And it wanted, as Isaac Asimov put it, he wished the new wave would recede and leave real science fiction on the stand. But I think when new wave no longer became the in thing, it did have a big effect. It changes, it incorporated more of an emphasis on style and more of an emphasis on characterization. The old guard, Isaac Asimov, for instance, once published a famous essay called The Little Tin God of Characterization, because he didn't think characterization was as important as ideas and plot. I don't think you can separate them. But there have been a lot of changes since I first started, both in what is bought and where it's bought, and as Scott says, where it's published. If you look at the award lists now, almost all of the short fiction is online, is coming from online sources. And of course, that's a big change because there was no online when we started.
Well, they invented electricity just before we started. So.
Well, speak for yourself.
Yeah, I think Orson and Nancy nailed it, that the way you're discovered has changed so much. And I haven't been at it as long, but when I got started, the tools of self-publishing were just becoming available so that you could actually do a short story and publish it yourself and print on demand and it not be onerously expensive. You could publish it on the Kindle for 99 cents. And so I got really my break with short story as well, because there were the tools to publish them that way. And you look at The Martian, which Amy Weir serialized on her blog, and other people have found success through fan fiction sites and straight to audiobook. So there's so many different ways of discovery now. And I think that's been a huge change in the industry. People now are getting discovered on Twitter writing microfiction. Yeah, I co-published with an author. I fell in love with her writing through Twitter. She would write an entire story in one tweet. And I was like, I gotta get you writing novels. And so
I'm going to sound really behind it. A tweet is no longer limited to 144 characters.
It is.
288 now.
Yeah, maybe it's double that.
The whole story in 288
the whole story.
characters?
Yeah, she's amazing.
I usually have 4 or 5 characters in this order. So Scott and Nancy are exactly right in everything they said about the history, and of course Hugh was exactly right about everything he said about the present status. And so I'm going to take a slightly different tack and say, when I started writing, I was really lucky because I started writing my first story in 1980, first novel published in 1990, first story published in 1980. But in 1985, the CBC sent me to New York City to interview science fiction writers on Canadian, CBC's Canadian Broadcast Corporation. Interviewed Isaac Asimov. And Asimov, I asked him, what qualifies as success for you in your writing? And he said, if I make myself and my readers happy in that order, I'm happy, I'm satisfied. And so when I started, people wrote the books that they wanted to read themselves. Today, people are writing books that they think the algorithm will promote. And I think it's pernicious, and I think it is contrary to the spirit of this as an artistic endeavor, and I decry it. But that's the state of the art right now.
Aren't you making some sweeping generalizations there?
There's still exceptions.
Yes, because you took some of my time to have a back and forth with you about how many characters compose a tweet. So I just supposed to go straight to the heart of the matter and express it succinctly and memorably, which is all they will take away from the panel.
Sometimes human generalizations are appropriate.
I can't let that stand. I'm sorry. You and I have argued over so many things over the years. This will just take one more. There are a lot of good writers right now that are not just writing with
Absolutely.
the audience.
Absolutely. And some of them even know how many characters are in a tweet and are up to date. I don't know why, if I decide to add something rather than echo, and I acknowledge that what you said was correct, and what Scott said was correct, and what Hugh said was correct, and I decided to share a different perspective. That is my lived life experience, and I want to share it. Please allow me.
Great.
I allow you. It's just not nuanced enough.
Okay, thanks. Okay, S.M. Sterling, you're on.
One other thing that has changed is that the field is no longer as closely dominated by the big publishers as it was. I sold my first story 13 years before it eventually got published because successive quasi-magazines went broke. It came out at the same time as my first novel, which was from Signet. And in those days, self-publishing was known as vanity publishing, and it was a sentence of death. If you did it, you were classified as not serious about writing for the rest of your life. These days, there are far more independent publishers, there are smaller publishers, there are bigger publishers. The classic old school publishers have receded from their once total domination of the market. For example, I have a book coming out from Mark Manor next year, and it's the concluding book in a trilogy that I originally sold to Tor. And actually, the first time an editor at Tor looked at the first book in this series, he said, it's too much like science fiction. Well, I said sort of. And yeah, they meant that it was too much like classic science fiction, but that trilogy, let's see, of course, The Crimson Kings, The Sky People, and now Lords of Creation, which is going to be the third, which I always had planned, but couldn't get to write, are coming out from Mark Manor, which is a small but respectable press, and I'm delighted. And the guy who runs Art Manor is a classic science fiction fan, and far too many of the traditional publishers have been taken over by accountants. If you want to know what happens to a company when it's taken over by accountants rather than people who are closely involved in what the company does, look at Boeing. Yeah. And you'll get an idea, you know, like they've got their astronauts stuck on the space station because it's not safe to bring them back on the thing that launched them up there. SpaceX will be bringing them back. Yeah, so there's more and more varied ways to get into the field these days. But there's a downside to that, and that is that the traditional publishers' first readers strained out a lot of really bad stuff. I had a friend who was a first reader at a major publishing house, and they had what they called a funny file. And it was stuff that was not just bad, but that was actively jaw-droppingly bad. Like the story of a guy who had been shipwrecked on one of the sea islands off the coast of Georgia and was raised by the family goat. I quote from the outline, being raised by the family goat had took its toll of him. And that sort of stuff is much more likely to see the light of day on the internet than it was back in the old days. So there's good and there's bad. I think there's more good than bad, but that's how it goes.
I got to say how much I love hearing that Tor told you it was too much like science fiction. Because when I hated the cover on Understand, I was told by my editor, oh, but we need to communicate that it's science fiction. And I said, well, it will say science fiction. It will be sold in the science fiction section. It will have my name on it, and I've published in science fiction before. And he said, no, we want them to know it's science fiction, which it wasn't. But nevertheless, that was the audience they wanted to reach. And I realized, okay, what they're really saying is, the money is going to be in something that sounds like hard science, because fantasy had not yet become so enormously profitable. And so a lot of readers were looking for hard SF, but I just am stunned at the hilarity that you were rejected because it was too science fiction for Tor.
Yeah, that was the first science fiction book I picked up in a bookstore, and I kept reading and waiting for the cover to, like, when's the space shuttle going to fly over this? Every page, come on.
advantage, but not an advantage. The internet has made it possible for groups of young writers to communicate with each other much more readily. And in fact, just starting from the fan base, when I came into science fiction, we were extremely isolated. If you were the one person who read science fiction in your high school, you were frequently the figure of fun, because you're the geeky person who had comic books and looked at them. And I was not ashamed to say so. But it has also given people a peer group that they did not have before, and that is also for the young writers to get together across the miles, that we're no longer geographically limited to communicating with people who feel the same way that we do, who are working together, who can encourage one another. And I see both better science fiction and fantasy coming from a lot of these young independents, but also I'm seeing a lot of echo chamber things. For example, if you went on BookBub or one of the other services that releases free or discounted science fiction and fantasy every single day, you find things like werewolf stories that all use the same vocabulary, and they have a dreadful sameness to them. And something that I had come to associate with Harlequin romances, they were this long, they had, according to Barbara Cartland, the main character name that ended with A because she thought that was lucky. And you could interchange all of the characteristics of the story very easily. These werewolf books, these vampire books, these paranormal books are all very, very alike. And the independent ones, the unique ones, are lost in the sludge, unfortunately. The good ones will eventually find their way, like Hugh's books, like Larry Correa. There are others who have risen to the top for not quite good reasons, Neil James. And the internet has become a tool for good and for ill, but I think that it has encouraged people who really want to write to come forward. And now they know where to send things, which we did not before. When I was 19 and sent my first story to Analog, Stan Schmidt sent me a personalized, very nice letter saying, really like your style, I've seen this plot before, so send me something else. I had no one to tell me that that was a good thing, because I did not know about the hierarchy of rejection letters at the time. I had no one I could ask. Now, somebody who receives something similar can. We have demystified those things, and that is good, because now we know the inner workings of, say, the legacy publishers, and we know how to find good small press publishers. Could not do that before.
Steve mentioned something. You mentioned your most recent novel, which I learned for you, Kasich, and my penultimate novel was Kasich. When I started out, and all of us started out, a very significant difference was an editor could make a buy decision at a Big Five back then, Big Seven, and Big Six, Big Five publishing house on their own. David Hartwell was my editor for many years. Tor, the great late David Hartwell, and there was an amount, a dollar amount in advances that he was, and it was hired through the corporation. The higher up you are in the corporation, the more experience, you're not an assistant editor, associate full editor. There's a buying amount that you can authorize. Yes, I'm going to buy that book from Rob, from Steve, from Nancy, who's also in the Dave's authors, and done deal. Every major publisher now, it's a editorial committee who makes the decisions, and the acquiring editor is your advocate who says, we should publish this book. And they're like, well, it's kind of like the book I want to do in my line, and I'm not going to, what's the blurb? The other people who are deciding your fate haven't read your book. And so Steve, myself, Harry Turtledove, James Morrow, these are authors who have gone to Kasich. There are other equally good small presses because the publisher at Kasich, in this particular case, can simply say, yes, and that's it. And so there's none of this, well, somebody is saying it's too much sci-fi or not quite the marketing or we don't know how to place this one on the, yes, and it's done. And so there's been an exodus, a significant exodus of authors who are just fed up with the delays in approvals, acceptance, payment, and so forth from the Big Five, and have decided that there are greener pastures and equally beneficial pastures to be tilling our soil with.
Yeah, a committee is the only form of mammalian life with more than 4 limbs and no brain.
Yeah.
Okay.
All of this applies a lot to novels, but you're probably here to discuss short stories, since that's what the contest focuses on. And in that case, you still do have, except for the odd slush pile reader that comes through, a single editor at magazines looking at and making decisions. And sometimes it can take quite a while because they get an enormous backlog.
Yes.
2 years ago, I asked Sheila Williams how many stories Asimov's gets every month. Roughly 800. And a lot of them, she doesn't have to read all the way through. She didn't have a slush reader at this point. Because I have asked over the years, because I teach writing a lot, and over the years I have asked practically every short story fiction editor in the business, how long does a story take to reject? And I don't mean that they're not going to read the Goodwins all the way through, but how long to take before you decide, or I don't want to read anymore? And they have all told me the same thing. 3 long paragraphs. This is why you really have to work on the beginnings of your stories and polish them, make sure that they really work. Because they are looking for a reason to not buy you. Not because they hate you, but because they have 800 stories a month in their slush reader. And also, and this is going to sound counterintuitive, but it's true. And it's actually it's reassuring if you look at it in the right way. You have to be better at the end of your career than you do at the beginning. Because at the end of your career, if your name is on it and it's known, you can publish stuff that is not as good as it should be, usually. I'm talking short stories now. But at the beginning of your career, if you're submitting to Asimov, say, you're competing with Rob, who has a name. You're competing with Steve and Jody and Scott and Hugh. And as a result, because their names on the cover will make some sales, your story might be equally as good. Now, that sounds discouraging, but it's not, because the way you can look at it is, this might be a really good story you just wrote. It's just that nobody knows who you are yet. But if you keep on with it, that really good story will go somewhere, and eventually they will know who you are.
Some of you may have read Tea with the Black Dragon by Ray Bradbury. It was rejected 13 times. And she sold it to the first publisher she had submitted to because they had changed editors. And it's a great story. It's marvelously well written.
Joe Haldeman's The Forever War was rejected over 40 times.
Wow.
And he just kept on going. And the same thing happened. He went back and the editorial chair changed.
Yeah, stubbornness is a virtue in this field. I was in a writers group in Canada in the 1980s. We called ourselves the Bunch of Seven. It was a play on words for a school of painting. And one of our members sent in a novel, and they got a long letter from an editor saying, I like this novel, but there are a few problems, and if you could fix this, and this, please resubmit. And, you know, we were ignorant of publishing because none of us were professionals yet. But we all said, oh, God, that's a great letter. And she said, no, he rejected it and put it in a drawer and never touched it again. So that was a case where there was plenty of talent, but not enough persistence.
Now, one thing I want to be able to...
A couple of our judges from last year or the year before just kick-started an anthology of stories that have been rejected repeatedly before they found a home, and they asked a couple of the judges, myself included, to submit one. I put one in that 17 times rejected, reprinted now dozens of times, multiple award nominee. But yeah, this is the key, perseverance. A rejection is of that story by that editor in that particular mood on that particular day, not a rejection of you and your dream of being a writer.
Yeah, I have to tell you from my perspective, after I sold my first story, I sold my second and third only with revisions, with Ben Bother telling me how to do it. And then I couldn't sell anything, and I thought, well, that was my whole career. It's the story Ender's Game, and then it's over. And Ender's Game itself was rejected 5 times. There weren't that many magazines, so everybody rejected it, including Ben, who wanted me to cut it in half, and I wasn't going to. But the thing is, if you're smart enough to listen to an editor, don't do what he says to do. Fix the thing that made him say that.
Yeah. Like my first book, I sold in 1984. By the way, I'm a natural novelist. I've compared writing a good short story to stuffing a cat into a Coke bottle without hurting it. I eventually mastered it, but novels came first for me. And the editor wrote back and said, well, this is a good post-apocalyptic story, but we want something that's more fantasy-oriented. So I said, sure. And I added an evil shaman in 15,000 words. And it got published. Terrible cover, by the way.
Okay, so I want to just get
It's a very good book, though. You should be proud of it.
Gentlemen,
Yeah.
so, because we're almost to the halfway point on this, one of the things, reason why we have Rise of the Future, these are all judges for it, one of the things that we use to determine who's going to become the judges, and it's very important for us, is these are all people who like helping and paying forward to the next generation. There are other people I've spoken with who are equally as impressive with their published books that I won't ask. I won't invite them. I want to get into even a discussion with it because I take a look at who they are and what do they do to be able to help the next generation of authors. And these are all proven as important for them. Not as important as a career, but it's important for them to make sure that the next generation, science fiction, I know Scott, you said, like, I want good stuff to read too. So it's also maybe to a certain degree selfish, but nevertheless, they have the ability to do that. And that's why they've all been selected and brought on board as judges. What I'm going to do here is a 3-minute video that I found recently of Ray Bradbury at our first year. And it's advice that he gave. It's not, nobody's seen it before. So I'm going to play this, and you guys, you'll see it from here.
So I saw this last week at Tampa Bay Comic-Con, but I urged, and so did Jody, but you judges who haven't seen it, go, if you want, go watch it. It's a great video, and it's about 5 minutes. Go down to the front row and have a watch.
Okay, somebody messed up the sound in this thing here. It was fine earlier.
It was Luigi.
Sure wasn't Mario?
I think Mario's fixing it.
Okay.
And maybe whoever's been flicking the lights off, Brian could turn them down a bit too.
Somebody gave me the correct thumbs up and said, oh. All set up.
Explosive advice. Yay! Oh!
Try it again.
Oh, no,
Oh, word.
Can't wait to look for 1 second.
So while they're fiddling, Jody very wisely mentioned that there's a lot of online support. WritersOfTheFuture.com, our discussion forum, free to join, great support for your works in progress, for information on markets, not just the contest. Judges sometimes hang out there, past winners. Absolutely the place to go. WritersOfTheFuture.com, free online support.
And actually on that, just to complete that, what you're going to find on Rise of the Future, we've got both portals and the contest. We're going to upload a story there. We have I have a podcast, which is we want to make all the guests on the podcast. We get about 2 million listens per episode. It's very popular. It's Rise of the Future podcast. And then we also have a forum, an online forum, which is, again, free center. There's just one basic rule. You can't, no dumping on anybody, no dissing. You got one warning, and if the person does it a second time, they're banned from the forum. It's one of the best forums for the last 3 years. And we have a blog and a free online writing workshop, which you can lock access there as well. And it's something that's been, very successful, and it continues to grow. And that's the last thing. So we ready here?
You can play a little sound.
It's playing. Okay, so yeah, and I'm gonna start from the beginning now, so here we go.
I'm here with a legend in his own time, Mr. Ray Bradbury, a man who has accomplished such magnificent works as The Illustrated Man, Something Wicked This Way Come, The Martian Chronicles. After all this time, and in view of the fact that we have a celebration here tonight for new writers, what advice would you want to give to new writers starting out?
Oh, the same advice I took from others when I was young. Fall in love and stay in love and do what you love. And that's a good life, isn't it? If you just, I fell in love with science fiction when I was 8. The architectures of the future I saw on the covers of the science fiction magazines. The World's Fairs I went to, which illustrated those science fictions in architecture. So I began to write when I was 12, and I wrote every day of my life, but I always wrote about things I cared about. Landing on the moon, colonizing Mars, going with John Carter various places, swinging with Tarzan in the trees. So I never gave up on those loves, and as a result, I've had a good life. So that's the best advice you can give to a writer. Don't write for money, write out of love about something that you really care about, and that way you're going to do good work.
I know that you're a person that likes to help young writers yourself, similar to L. Ron Hubbard and other authors that are trying to give these new writers a break in a world that can be less than kind to the artists. Why do people such as yourself want to do this?
Well, you have to pass on the gift. Other people influenced me when I was 18 and 19. Henry Kuttner was one of my teachers, a friend. Lee Brackett, Edmund Hamilton. They all influenced me and put up with me. So therefore, now that I'm older, I have to do the same thing for kids who are coming up. Otherwise, I'd feel guilty, wouldn't I? I'd feel terrible. And anyway, it's fun. If you find a really good, talented young person, as I discovered 25, 30 years ago, Charles Beaumont, who was just a kid, 22 years old, showed me his first short story. I said, that's wonderful. So it was very easy to help him because he was helping himself and he was full of pomegranate seeds.
So with that in mind, I said you're all judges for the very reason of helping pay it forward, which is what this is all about for this panel here. So we'll keep this to a couple minutes each. So what advice would you have then for a new writer? Start with Scott and we'll move on down.
Well, his advice that you write what you love is absolutely true. If you don't care about and believe in and understand your own story, why are you writing? You have to care about it. And if you don't care about it, neither would you read it. If you're just doing something by formula or because you know that this is what sells, they're going to know that you don't care. It shows up in your work because your work reveals more about you than you had any idea of at the time. You discover who you are by looking back of the things you wrote 40 years before. because you stand revealed. And if you do not care about the person that you're writing about, the characters, if you don't care about the subject matter, if you don't understand the subject matter, it's going to stick out like crazy. And you won't have an audience.
Good, and that's just one point what he said there. On my podcast, I read a book a week almost when I interview an author, and I won't interview an author until I've read the book. And when he says you can totally tell an author about an author with what they've written, and so it makes it very easy for me to ask much more deep and searching questions because you can see into the author's soul with what they've actually written. You may say.
I consider there's two parts to writing. There's imagination, and which goes along with what you love, and then there's craft. I don't think the imagination you've already got. You've got that imagination. Nobody is going to be able to give you that. The craft you can learn, because writing is essentially the art of translating the vision in your head, which is probably multisensory. You see your characters walking around, you hear them, the background is there. It's all there at once, like a movie almost. But reading and writing are linear. This detail, and then this detail, and this detail, and then this detail, to create the same effect that you have in your reader's mind. That part, the craft part, you can learn. And my advice would be to try to keep an open mind about improving your craft. Don't belong to the change one comment in this and you die school of response that sometimes writers fall into. Instead, read craft books, read good fiction, read stories you love and try to figure out how they got that effect. And it's all right to imitate in the beginning when you're learning. My first published novel, which David Hartwell bought, was totally in the style of Peter Beagle, something noted by every single reviewer. And it was deliberate. I was doing that. I was trying to learn. And I learned by imitating Beagle's style because I loved it. I didn't stick with it. But this is how you learn. So my advice would be, and it's really hard to do, try to become the reader as you're writing, as well as becoming the writer.
That's great advice. The two things I tell aspiring writers is read voraciously. Make sure you never give up your love of reading as you're transitioning to writing. And also write a lot of different things. Don't get stuck on that one novel, that first world you come up with, and keep writing in that world and keep revising that first novel. This is a great thing about short stories is you can play with a lot of styles, a lot of voices, explore a lot of ideas and characters, and move on to the next thing. For me, it was like the seventh thing that I published that took off. And so if you don't move on and try the next idea, you may never find the kind of story that you'll put your best work into. So those are my two biggest advices. Read a lot and write a lot.
And just to expand on what Hugh said, which is absolutely right, read a lot within and without the genre that you're interested in. Read voraciously. Yes, if you're science fiction, fantasy, horror, dark fantasy, whatever it is you write, absolutely, you've got to know that field cold, because the editors do. And what you think is new and exciting, they may think, and with justification, is cliche and an old hat. So you have to know your field, but read widely for style. And I must say, as you become an author, you can deduct the expenses of any book, because you can always tell in Canada, the CRA, here the IRS, that you are reading it for stylistic research. You have to read widely in fiction and non-fiction. Write not just what you know, but what you can find out about.
Yeah, the other thing is, when you're reading your own stuff, you have to be able to step back and read it the way someone who hasn't seen it before will read it. I've seen people who have all the drive and the imagination, but they can't separate the ideal version in their head from what actually goes down on the page, and that means they can't improve. You have to be able to read what you've written the way someone who's coming to it cold would, and see what's coming across and what isn't coming across right. And that's one of the essential features of learning craft. Also, advice from successful writers can help. Poole Anderson gave me some really good advice when I was just starting out. I showed him a couple of things. He was kind enough to read them. God knows why. And he told me, for example, when you want someone to be really immersed in a scene, use all the senses. not just vision, because humans are visually oriented, but sight, sound, smell, taste, physical sensations. They make it more immediate. And that was a really good piece of advice, which I've been using ever since. And that sort of thing is essential.
To a young reader, to a young writer, I say, dare. Try something that you haven't tried before. A lot of people hold back. They are afraid to go forward and actually write a story and to send a story in. If you're waiting for someone to give you permission, I give you permission. Please send in your stories, write the thing that is in your heart. Try something that you haven't tried before, because you can't succeed until you do it. You can't send it in until it's finished. You have to do it. And if you've got this wonderful story, we're waiting to read it. We need things to read too. And the other thing that I would add to that is research. You think that you know your city, you think that you know the place that you live, the profession that you have. Until you start writing about it, you'll realize there are gaps in my knowledge of my own craft or skill or family, what have you. And it will add so much texture, so much flavor to the story that you're writing. And it will change where your plot is going to, because you'll know things about it that you didn't know before. And other stories will open up from that. So the ever-expanding mind, as Nancy said, is to open up your mind, your consciousness, to allow yourself to try new things. So research will also help. Do not fall down the rabbit hole. Terry Brooks told a story, I was at DragonCon here some years ago, about his friend Jean Owl, a lady clad at the cave bear, who had told him that she had gone out on the tundra to sleep, to see what it was like, and to tan hides to see what Isla would be doing. She had gone down the rabbit hole so far that 6 months goes by, 9 months goes by, and finally Terry said to her, "Write the damn book."
So now,
it's also a good idea to read fiction from different periods. Because fashions in fiction change and change again and then change and new. Well, everything that was old is new again eventually. But people in different periods have different orientations, different values. And reading their fiction, as well as reading nonfiction, historical nonfiction, can give you a better sense of how to get across an alien character. Now, in science fiction and fantasy, that is essential. There's nothing more boring than a well-constructed world with, fantastical creatures or super science, and everybody is like a early 21st century North American suburbanite, and looks at the world in the same way they do. And I find that like excruciatingly dull.
Okay, so what we're going to do right now is what we're looking for as judges, because we're down to 15 minutes to go here. So, Scott.
Nan was exactly right when she said it's flipped around fantasy versus science fiction. I'm a science fiction writer, she's a science fiction writer. The number one thing I have to look for is my own prejudice when your stuff comes in, because my preferential choice of reading in a bookstore would be to grab science fiction. So I try very hard, and I know we all do, to set aside what our personal taste is to look for the quality of the craft. So you have one chance with us. It's anonymous, as John said. We don't know your gender orientation, your nationality, your name, anything. You have one chance to make that first impression. So the craft is going to be what impresses me. And whether it's science fiction, fantasy, or whatever it is that may or may not be my own personal wheelhouse of writing and reading, it's the craft that I look for first.
Okay, Scott?
When, we don't read the slush, we only get the quarterly winners, and we're choosing among them to see who is the grand prize winner. So I have never had a bad story cross my desk from Writers of the Future, because they've already weeded out the bad stories, or the weak stories, or the almost perfect stories. But I will say that if it's in present tense, my eyes glaze over, because that's what every graduate writing program is trying to get their students to do. And it only works in French. In English, we don't like our present tense. We like our past tense. And that's how we tell true stories. But, so there are things that irritate me, but I have voted for a story that was in present tense before. because it was the best of the four. Because the story, the plain tale, what happens and why, is what matters. And the execution, there can be flaws. It's okay. Nothing's perfect, except, of course, Nancy's fiction. So, but I also think you shouldn't worry about if anybody who reads your story says, "Oh, that's just like," and then mentions another story. They're not your friend. They're not helping you, because there's no such thing as an original idea. Shakespeare never wrote except from sources. Well, one of his weakest plays, Merry Wives of Windsor, was just all cliche, but not from any one source. And yet, Shakespeare made them come alive because he knew his characters, he made them real, he cared about his stories. You can see that he cared about the stories. And so, just don't worry about originality. My best short story ever, a little thing called Unaccompanied Sonata. Years after I wrote it, and it came in second for the Hugo. They started announcing the order of finish. That was a stupid idea. It just depresses the guy who came in second. But and it was George Martin who won. Anyway, not that I care. But years later, I realized that what I had done was rewritten in my own way the story Toonsmith by Lloyd Biggle Jr., which I had read at about the age of 9, way before I knew how to understand what I was seeing as craft. And so when I had a chance to do a double volume, I linked one of my novellas with Lloyd Biggle Jr.'s Toonsmith because it deserved to stay in print. The things that worked in Unaccompanied Sonata were the things that worked for me in Toonsmith. Now the plot, you might read both and not have any idea that I'd ever read his or he mine, but I knew what I was doing, and it's not a problem. No one accused me of imitating Lloyd Biggle Jr. I mean, no one ever did except me, and I'm guilty. I confess it. But so what if somebody else worked with that trope? So what? You make your story out of it. And all the pieces you put together are going to be something else.
Thank you.
Mediocre writers have influences, great writers.
Rob used the phrase quality of fiction, quality of craft, and that's what I'm looking for. Even if a story has some flaws, when I get them, and I don't just get the final four, somehow I'm a judge along the way.
Okay, so I'm a second-rate judge.
No, you're a final judge. I do both. I'm a final judge, but I also see all of us are final judges, but I also see someone. What you really do? What I look for is, I'm looking for some complexity. It may be that a character has got more than one side to him or her, because most people do. It may be that the setting is more complex. It's not suffering from the Delaware syndrome, which is when everything in it looks and sounds as though it came from the state of Delaware in the 1950s. I'm looking for, stylistically, that flash of that interesting phrase, that sentence that shows that this is a person that cares about words. And do I get all of these, or I'm looking for an idea, or the way an idea plays out that seems original and interesting? Do I get all of this stuff in the same story? No, I don't even get all that stuff into my stories. But I'm looking for some kind of complexity and originality in something, and for a feeling that this is something this author cares about. And if I can get both of those, even if the story itself is imperfect, and on that final four, I have voted with strong preference for first place on some things that have not gotten first place, because they haven't struck other judges in the same way they struck me. But every story that has won first place eventually is a good story.
Yeah, I second everything Nancy just said. That's what really draws me in. And what I'm really looking for is something that'll make me forget that I'm judging for an anthology. Every now and then you get a story and you're just reading as a fan. You get sucked in and you're like, it's not working anymore. Because I set aside time for this, to sit down and get through a couple of stories. When I hit that one that I look at my wife afterwards, I'm like, oh my God, this is one of the best things I've read in so long. And I'm like fired up. I want to go work on my project because of it. Those are the ones that get the highest rating for me.
Great.
It happens a lot with these stories.
And that's why some of the winners of Writers in the Future have gone on to stellar careers. Benny Okorafor, Karen Joy Fowler, that's just two off the top of my head. But they started out as Writers in the Future judges.
Rob?
I judged a contest, not this one. I don't have an exclusive contest. It was last month for When Words Collide at a multi-genre literary convention in Calgary. And would you like to be our celebrity judge? Sure, I'm happy. Here's the rubric you're going to use for story. 10 points for originality, 10 points for style. I said, no, I refuse. Because if you were to do that rubric and apply it to various really successful works, like say Harry Potter, 0 on originality, it would never win your contest. It is always a subjective evaluation in the end. Did the story knock your socks off? Do you remember it the next day? Right? So yes, we look for all these nuanced, different categories of things, but in the end, it's how powerful the story was. Did it make an impact? And so impactfulness, memorability, I think for me is above all the other. I can forgive some clumsy craft. There are great New York Times best-selling novelists who are very clumsy craftspersons, but tell a really rip-roaring story, right? It's subjective in the end. It's subjective.
Okay. Steve? Would you already answer that? You feel?
What are you
looking
I was
for?
going to say, yeah. Craft is important, but the fire, the vividness of the vision in the writer's head is also really important. Robert E. Howard was not a bad writer, technically speaking, but he always really lived what he was writing, or at least most of the time. And when he did, it would just blow your socks off. So if the story makes you surrender to it, it has real impact. I mean, I've never seen a technically bad story come across my desk with Writers of the Future. As you said, they're screened out before they get to us. So when I get 4 or 5 or 6 stories, I look at them all, and sometimes it's a real puzzle, but other times it's the impact of the story. And I say, they're all well written. This one really hit me.
I do see a lot of Drudge come across my desk because my deputy team of slushers is weeding out the very, very, very not ready for prime time stories, and I get the ones that they say, this is at least a story. It's at least got a big beginning, middle, and ending, and what I'm looking for is that spark, that thing that says, this is not like the other stories. And the real winners have a confidence about them that they believe in themselves. These are consistent, coherent stories, and whether or not they are in a subgenre that I like, I am willing to set aside my own feelings about things. I don't like horror. I really don't like dystopias. But I have put through horror stories and dystopias because they were excellent. They made me feel what they are. They gave me a sensation that I was reading something new. And that's not easy to find, considering I've read a lot, and my fellow judges get to see things. I know Hugh and I have agreed on a couple of things that we thought should have been first place, but unfortunately the other judges didn't agree with us. But they were excellent, excellent stories, and I remember them. And that is really one of the things to say. I agree. Memorable nature, excellent craft, characterization. And another thing what we have mentioned is to start moving immediately. Don't make me wait too long to see where your story is going. A short story is a very small piece of real estate. You do not have enough time to make the reader wait to see where you're going, who the characters are, what the aim of the story is. Save that for your epic novels. Short stories are immediate. They are one arc entity. And I want to find the best of the best. Sometimes they just blow me away to start with. Sometimes they grow on you a little bit, but they always have that fantastic confidence about them.
Now I promised that we'd have question and answer, so we're down to our last 5 minutes or so. If somebody has a question, just If anybody has a question, we can, otherwise I have plenty of questions too. Does anybody have a question to ask of any of the judges? Yes, in the back. Yes.
I can yell. So do you guys have specific criteria for moving from honorable to silver to semi? Are there certain things that you look for when you start reading out and saying next level, next level, next level?
You gotta take that, Jody.
I'm the only one who does that. When I read a story and, yeah, it's got a beginning, middle, and an ending, and it's okay. Honestly, honorable mentions can go all the way from, it's a story, you know, it's good enough, to, oh yeah, that's pretty good. That's competently written. I believe in that. I believe in the setting. I believe in the characters. But it doesn't have that spark that moves it to silver. The silver ones are the ones that, by the way, can be resubmitted. And if you get a silver and it comes back to you, go over it and see where it's lacking, why it didn't move on. And it may be just as simple as, I have the werewolf vampire romance already for this quarter, so try again next time. You know, thank you for playing, bing. To get to the finalist category, it has to be so smoothly written, so coherent, so well told that I cannot resist but show it to my fellow judges. So yeah, the honorable mention is it's a good enough story. It's a story, but it doesn't spark what I need to know, what I need to feel, and I feel confident sending it to Orson Scott Card, to Nancy Kress, to Rob Sawyer, to S.M. Sterling, to Hugh Howey. I want to be able to say, yes, this is a good story. I believe in it. You get to choose among the 8 that you received. You get to try and guess which one is the best, because sometimes they're all so spectacular you can't believe it.
Thank you. Okay, one more question. Okay, right up here.
For Orson Scott Card, when you wrote Ender's Game, it was based on a short story about battle support.
No, Ender's Game.
Oh, is it? Okay. No, I'm sure I thought it was a short. Okay.
Yeah, no, I had a short story.
What's the question?
What's the question?
The question is, what inspired you and motivated you to write Ender's Game?
I needed to make money because my theater company had lost money that summer. And so I knew that science fiction paid not a lot, but more than I had. And so even though I had a job, that job wasn't paying for anything. So I wrote a story that I thought of when I was 16. And the only reason I thought of it when I was 16 was because I was given by my brother and his intended the Asimov's Foundation trilogy. And at the end of that, I thought, wow, I wonder if I could think of a science fiction idea, a science fiction story. Which, by the way, is not the best motive for writing science fiction. The best motive for writing is, well, if crap like that can get published, I can write. And that was the genuine one, because it means you have confidence in yourself. But I had to nurse that idea until I was 25 before I could even begin to put it down on paper. But when I did, I believed in it. You know, I wrote something I believed in. But what inspired me? Anybody who tells you they understand what inspires them is lying to themselves. They believe it. They're not telling you a falsehood. They just don't. We don't understand the motive for anything we do. Writers or otherwise. You know, everybody here, you've had the experience of going, now I know why I did that for something 40 years before, right? Well, obviously some of you have not lived it long enough to do that for something 40 years before. But anyway, you asking me for influence or idea or whatever, I don't believe in inspiration. I believe in doggedly asking yourself questions and finding answers that you really like.
Great, so we're up to our 2 o'clock. So I want to thank all of our panelists. It's been great. We've also got these cards up here you can get for anything on writers in the future. And then we also have a booth in Hall 2, booth number 1413, where you can come in and get the books that they've got stories in, as well as you'll see who's signing over the next few days in the booth. Thank you very much.